We're going to pause temporarily on building more features in our React application, and we're going to take a diversion and talk about something called version control. So version control software is a program that allows you to record the changes that you make to files in your project over time. And this has a lot of benefits. One is that it will allow us to back up our code nicely. Another is that it will allow us to have this history so we can fly back in time to previous points in the development. And it will also allow us to collaborate easily with other developers. So in this class, we're going to be using Git as the version control software. Just so you know, there are other options out there. And we're going to be using GitHub as the cloud platform where we are going to be syncing our code to a server. So GitHub allows us to have a backup of our code remotely, but also allows us to collaborate with other developers through GitHub. So setup. Before we get started, go to github.com and sign up for an account if you haven't already. Grab GitHub Desktop if you haven't already. And if you're on Windows, download Git Bash if you haven't already. If you're on a Mac, let me pull up the link here. You should be able to install Git pretty easily if you open up a terminal window and type in git-version. If you don't already have Git, you'll be prompted to install it. So let's talk about Git and the idea of version control. So inside of a project, which is called a repository in version control, you can find all of the source files. So here I have a library that I've written for extruding tiles. That the sort of like content of what it is doesn't really matter, but you can see all of the source files for that project, and you can see a series of commits. So each of these is a snapshot of the project at different moments in time, and there's a message associated with it that explains what that commit did. So if I check out one of these, I can see that this was a commit, a very small one, that involved changing the README and removing an in-progress note from the changelog. So a repository in Git is a project that has this history associated with it. And for a more formal definition of version control, I'll make sure that this is linked, but version control is a system that records the changes to a file or set of files over time so that you can recall specific versions later. And if we scroll down here, there are some nice graphics that explain the kind of general idea of version control. And this last one is a distributed version control system, which is what Git uses. So for instance, on my computer, I have a file that is in a repository, and on my local computer, there is a database of the previous versions of that file. So every time I've made a change and I've done something called committing, I am basically creating a new version and storing it in that database. So I have a full history of that file on my computer, and when I sync this to GitHub servers, GitHub has a full history of that file. And what this also allows us to do then, if we can have a local history on my computer and a history on the server, is another developer on the team can also pull down from GitHub and get a full history of that project, including that file. And so we can each introduce new versions on our own machine and sync them to one another through the server, through GitHub. So I'm going to open up a whiteboard and let's diagram out some of this to make sense of it. So when we have a project under version control, it is called a repository. You may hear the word repo. You may hear me refer to the word repo. That's just an abbreviation of repositories. When we're talking about a project that is under version control as a unit, it's a repository. So let's say we're creating a new project and we want it to be under version control. What we're going to do at regular points in time while working on the project is take snapshots of the files and label them with a commit message. So at any moment in time, we will create a commit, which is a snapshot of all the files in our project, and it has a message associated with it that we write. So maybe we're working on a project, it's a brand new project, and all we did was create an index.html here. So we could say created empty homepage. And what would be in that snapshot is that we added a file called index.html. And so then we would continue working on our project until we reached another point where we decided now is the time to take a snapshot of the project. And so maybe we take a snapshot here, and what we did at this point was created the About page. And in this snapshot would be the files that we want to save with this snapshot. And here I would register that I added my about.html file. And we'd continue on until we reach another point where we want to add, remove, modify files in our history. So here, maybe what we do is we styled the About page. And so what we did here was we probably modified about.html to link it to some new CSS, and then we added an about.css file. And so forth. You would continue working on the project, and then every once in a while you would go ahead and make a commit. And so a commit is going to have this commit message, along with the snapshot of all of the files that were changed. And it's also going to have something called an SHA, which is an abbreviation for simple hashing algorithm. You don't really need to know that in this class. It is just a unique identifier. So it'll be a long string of letters and numbers that uniquely identifies this commit. So each commit is going to have its own ID, this SHA, and sort of for background, this number is generated from the files that you've changed, the files that are included in this snapshot. So it's kind of based on the files that you've made, but it's generated and it is unique. So when you're looking through your history, you'll see a lot of these numbers, and you can also use those numbers to talk about specific commits, like to say, I want to jump back in time to some commit in the history. Okay, so we have our project, it's under version control, and one of the benefits of this version control is that at any moment in time, I can jump back. So let's say when I styled the page, I really didn't like the styling that I did. I could instead just jump back to this point in time and have my unstyled about.html that I could restyle. This becomes more important when you're working with other developers or working on big projects where maybe what happened was you rolled out a project, you added a new feature, you deployed it so other people are accessing it, so your users are using it, and a whole bunch of bugs got reported. And what you could do at that point, so like here's our history, we added this lovely feature here that is causing a whole lot of bugs for our users. What we can do is just hop back to a previous point, redeploy this version, and then figure out our bug. What was changed that in this version here that we need to undo to be able to roll out our new feature. So let's look at some diagrams from online about repositories. So this diagram, this cheat sheet is from Rebel Labs and is a helpful way to think about the basic commands that come with Git. Git is a command line tool, so you can run all of it from your terminal, even though we'll be using a GUI as we are working on Git, a graphical user interface. But there are a couple stages that are involved when you're working on a Git repository. So you have your working directory, which is the files on your computer, the latest version of all of them. And when you want to do this process of putting something into a snapshot, what you do is you select files, you add them to a staging area. So those are, you're sort of collecting a bunch of files together, like I'm saying add my about.html, I'm saying add my about.css, it's all in the stage. And then I run a commit, which is a command that I can use to create one of those snapshots and add a message. So I commit my about.html, my about.css from the staging area, and it ends up in my local repository. So that, if we go back to our previous diagram here, that's this internal database on your computer. So when you make a commit, you add a new version to that history. So these three stages are all happening on your local machine. And when we want to create a backup of our repository on another computer, or we want to be able to collaborate, so we want to push this to a place that other developers can access, that's where we end up running what is called a push command to take our local history and sync it with a remote server. So in our case, this remote repository is going to be github.com. And this whole process can run in reverse, where we have our local version, but another developer on the team has pushed something to the remote repository, a new feature, and we want to bring it into our working directory. We can do what is called a pull, which will take us through these stages to get those features that are in the remote repository into our working directory. So we're going to regularly go through this process where we're working, we are going to add and commit and push, and then at some point later when we decide to work again, we're going to do a pull, and then we're going to do an add, a commit, a push, and we're going to keep doing that kind of cyclical process, that cyclical workflow. Okay, enough concept. Let's actually get our project into version control. So I have the latest version that we were working on here. Nope, that is the HTML. Let's open up the latest version. So we're in week 3. Okay, so here is our working version that we created with Create React App. We have our pages that we created. They are loading in our app, which has the router, yada, yada, yada. So what we want to do is take this project and get it into version control. So a Create React App project is actually set up properly as a Git repository. We just have to add it to our account and push it so that the files that we've changed here end up in our GitHub account. So for instance, the way that I can tell that is if I reveal this in File Explorer and look and if I have my view turned on so that I can see hidden items, there is this special Git folder which has some info about the Git repository already there. That comes from the fact that we created our application with Create React App. It also has this Git Ignore file, which Git Ignore is really important when you're working on web projects where there are files that we don't want to send into our version control history. So for instance, that node modules folder, there's no reason for this 200 megabytes of stuff to be in our version control, because anyone who downloads the project can just run npm install, and based on our package.json and our package.lock, we'll get all of the appropriate versions pulled down when they need it. So Git Ignore is really important to set up to ignore things that don't need to end up in your repository. It ignores in the Create React App template the node modules. It also ignores the folder with the built Create React App project, which we'll see in a future video. If you're creating your React app from scratch, you'll want to make sure that you create a Git Ignore file, and at minimum, you ignore that node modules folder. But anyway, this project is already set up as a Git repository. So what we need to do is open up GitHub Desktop. So when you load up GitHub Desktop, you won't see a bunch of repositories in here yet. You'll be prompted to log in, but I have a bunch of repositories in here already. Like I have that repository that I was showing you, Tile Extruder, which has some work in progress stuff on it, but you can see what it's going to look like when we get our project in here. Is all of those commits, all of those snapshots in history are going to have their message associated with them. They're going to have their SHA, their SHA, and they are going to have a list of the files that were modified. So for instance, this is telling me that package.json, this line of code was removed, this line of code was added, so version went from 2.0.3 to 2.0.4. And can find that. Here's the README that we were looking at before, where this was removed and this was added. So what we want to do to get our project in here is go to File, Add Local Repository, and choose the path to our current project. So I have mine in this directory under week 3, so I'm going to select it. And we want to make sure that we're selecting the folder that contains all of our files, that we're not just selecting a specific file from the repository. So I'm grabbing create React app, or React quiz game 02. I am clicking add, and that adds my project into GitHub desktop. So right now this has a Git, this has been registered as a Git repository. So none of these files yet that I have that are showing up in the changes tab have been added to the history, but what has been added is the initialized project from create React app. So all of those files that were in there, like app.js, app.test.js, app.css, that came from the template are already in the history. So when we want to add files to our project, we can do that here. So clicking these files, if I go back to my diagram, clicking them is essentially adding them to the stage. So as I click, I am staging changes that I have made. In this case, what I want to do is just get if I use the top checkbox here to select all of these files, I want to create one commit that has all of this stuff that we've been working on. So what I'm going to do is, now that I have staged them by selecting them, I am going to create a commit and give it a name. So here I'm going to add a message that says added initial skeleton of quiz game with router, React router. And if you need to make a longer description, you can add it to the box down here. In general, what you want to do is have short descriptive commit messages, and then the description box can be for longer things that if you have to explain why things were changed in a certain way, you can do that in the description. So once I select all of those, add in my message and commit to master. If I look at my history, now there is this history. So from initializing, all of these files were added. And then in this commit, my package.lock was added. My package.json was modified. You can see tone was added, React confetti, React router. We can see that we got rid of those default components, app.css, app.js, and we added our components, app.js. So all of those files are included in this snapshot. So if I wanted to make another change and go through this same process, what I would do is go to my project, and maybe what I want to do is get rid of this README that came with the project. Actually, you know what? Let's leave the README because the README has some useful information. Let's go into one of our components, like let's go to our play page. And if I change the text here to be start the game and save this file, I am changing this in my working directory, but I have not committed this yet. So if I save this and I flip back to Git, it is going to register that I have removed this line and in its place, change the text to be start the game. So if I want to commit this, I can say changed the text on the play page to say start the game. And I can commit that. And now if I flip over to my history, I now have 3 snapshots of my project over time. So far, I have worked through this process, if we flip back to the diagram, of adding, committing, and getting everything into my local repository. But right now, this is not hooked up to a server like GitHub.com, where this code is backed up and the history is duplicated on another computer. So to be able to do that, what I need to do is publish this repository. So if we're using a create React app project, GitHub desktop is going to prompt us to say, what's the name of the what's the name of the application? So here I'm going to say, this is code sprint React quiz, and I can add a description of that repository. React quiz game for code sprint A at Columbia. And it's really important that if you're in this class, you make sure that you don't keep this code private. for your projects so that I'll be able to easily get access to them. Don't have to worry about the organization tab, and then you can hit publish repository. So this will take a second. You can see up at the top, it is resolving deltas. It's syncing things to GitHub. And once we've done that, we will have our history as we saw it before, but we will now be able to go to view, go to repository and click view on GitHub. So this is going to take us to that repository that was created on github.com. So here you can see all of the files of the project. We can see the commit history of the project. We can click on any of the commits and see what changed at any moment in time. And if we made this public, that means that other folks can check out our code. So this can be part of our code portfolio as developers and designers. This can also be something that we share with individuals, like if I want to invite someone to contribute to this project. If I made it public, I can share the URL with them so that they can check it out. They can clone it, they can download it onto their machine and work on the project. So I want to demo to you what it would look like if someone were to modify this on another computer. So what I'm going to do is just make a change to this README from the web interface. And let's say I'm just going to add the title here, code sprint React quiz app, and add a message here, added title to README, and commit it. Oops, I made a typo there. Oh well. So I have now made a change. Pretend that, another developer cloned this code. They made this change by committing it and pushing it. When I come and log into my computer and get ready to work on the project, what I want to do, if I know that I'm working on a project with other folks, is always fetch the latest. So if I click that button to fetch, what it's going to do is grab the latest changes. So let's go back to our diagram here. So when I hit that fetch button, what that did was pull the latest version of the history into our local repository. And then when I initiate a pull, what that's going to do is try to take all of those changes and merge it into my working directory. So in this case, now that fetch button has gone to pull, I click pull, and that's going to give me that new change to my project in my history here and also in my project folder. So if I go to the README, I now have this change that came from that edit in the browser. So this is the easiest version of pulling in changes, but when you're working with other developers, sometimes you change the same file and you end up in a place where there's a conflict. Which parts of which file get merged in to get the final version. So if we both added features to, say, this rainbow click component, two separate developers added changes, then you have to go through the process of resolving that merge conflict, which we're not going to talk about in this video, but that essentially means like cherry picking which lines from each developer should end up in the final version. If you're just working on a solo project in this class, you shouldn't really end up having merge conflicts, but just know that if you do, that means that there are two conflicting versions of a file, and Git, as smart as the software is not able to tell which pieces should end up in the final history. And that's all that really is involved in working with Git, is this process that we were seeing in this diagram. We're going to be committing things, pushing them to remote, so pushing them to GitHub, and then pulling them down when we start working on the project again. So this process, if you don't go through the add commit, your files won't be given a snapshot in history. So one piece of advice is to commit often. So make small changes and commit them, so you get this nice history with a lot of different points in time that you can jump back to. And then always remember to push when you're finishing up your work, so that any changes that you have on your local machine end up on your backup in GitHub's servers. So just to show you that workflow one more time, let's say that we wanted, instead of this rainbow click button, to have this default name as the default state, we could say enter a name as the default state. And if I go back to my history, it's showing me what file has changed. I would say changed the default name in rainbow click. I will commit that. So now it has been added to my local history, but it has not been pushed to GitHub. So I will make sure to push it before I finish working. So it's a new process, a new workflow to get used to, where you have to regularly go through this process of committing and pushing, and then potentially pulling if someone has made changes to the GitHub hosted version of the history that you need to pull down. So this is less automatic than if you used Dropbox or OneDrive or some of these pieces of software that you may use for syncing other types of non-code projects, which just run in the background always. This is a very intentional process that you have to go through, where you select what ends up in each snapshot and you put a meaningful message with each snapshot. And when you do that, you end up with a nice history that makes it really easy for you to go back in time and sort of look through the history at any moment, find where bugs were introduced, undo those bugs, or test out previous versions of the application, test out previous versions of the design if you're feeling like you want to pivot to a past version of your project. So this is a really valuable process to get accustomed to start working through so that you get the benefits of having that history. So we'll end this here. We'll introduce some more Git concepts as we continue on the project, but this should be enough to get you up and running with getting a Create React App project in GitHub as a repository and synced.